Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for wherever you are in the world. And thank you very much for joining this session on the impact of COVID-19 on trade flows in Africa. During the session, we'll be listening to some excellent speakers across the WTO's program in Africa, covering empirical evidence of the impact on trade through 2 case studies in Tunisia and Kenya, and the evidence of the impact on FDI in the case of Mauritius and Ghana. My name is Paul Baker, and I'm chairman of International Economics Consulting. Rimi Kundu from the Center for Global Trade Analysis, GTAP, is hosting and recording today's session and will help ensure that we keep to our allocated times. Before getting to the presentations, please allow me to remind everybody of the following session's protocol and etiquette so that the session can run smoothly. All attendees, except the person currently speaking, must remain muted. Unless otherwise noted, presentations will be 20 minutes long, and the session host will verbally prompt the presenter when there are 2 minutes remaining in our allocated times. When the allotted presentation time has elapsed, if the presentation has not already ended, the host will prompt again, and I will immediately move us onto the discussion phase. Discussions are open plenaries, which will last for 10 minutes and immediately follow each presentation. It's preferable for questions or comments to be entered into the chat. However, if participants raise their hands, we can also try and take those. I will monitor the chat and the participation list for raised hands during the discussion period, and I'll read chat entries out aloud so that the presenter can respond verbally and/or call upon the person with the raised hand to pose their question or comment to the presenter. This will continue until the host will prompt that there are only 2 minutes remaining in the discussion time, and at which point I will start wrapping up the discussions. Following each presentation, there will be a 2-minute transition period to allow the next presenter to share their presentations, and I will introduce during that period the next presenter. During this particular session, we'll be hearing from 4 different presenters, and without further ado, please allow me to introduce our first speaker, Amal Medini. Amal is a PhD candidate in economics at the École supérieure des sciences économiques et commerciales at the University of Tunis. She will present on the impacts of COVID-19 on Tunisian imports, which was co-authored with Leila Baghdadi, a professor of economics, also in the same school at the University of Tunis. The floor is now yours, Amal Medini.
Thank you so much, Mr. Paul, for your kind introduction. So please let me share my screen. Can you see? Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can now. Thank you, Amal.
Okay. So I'm very pleased today to share with you my co-authored paper on the impact of COVID-19 on Tunisian imports. So this work is part of a wider project on measuring firms' vulnerability to COVID-19 in developing countries. And we did it just after the pandemic to understand how it is impacting imports and the Tunisian economy in general. So the motivation behind our work is a huge supply shock caused by COVID-19 on many countries, and especially on developing ones like Tunisia. So we try to help identify the sources of vulnerability and the local industries that are mostly affected by the shock to help make better decisions and to put into place better strategies in the future. So Tunisia's trade flows experienced a significant decline after the pandemic, and imports decreased by 19% in 2020 compared to 2019, and exports decreased by 11% in the same period. However, these percentages are not fully caused by COVID-19 because the decline was taking place since 2018, as we can see from figure 1. but it's still huge compared to the decline between 2018 and 2019, which was about 7% for imports and 6% for exports. So this is just to have a global overview of the change in Tunisia's trade, but in what follows, we will focus mainly on imports. So figure 2 shows the change in Tunisian imports in more details. We can see that Tunisia's imports experienced a significant drop in all sectors except agriculture, which recorded a single drop in the second quarter of 2020. We can also see that sectors that participate in backward GPCs like machinery and textiles were heavily impacted in terms of their supplies since the first quarter of 2020. For instance, imports in the machinery sector experienced a decline in the first and second quarters of 2020, but then this decline was reduced in the third and fourth quarters, showing that the sector was relatively able to secure its sources of supply starting from the second quarter. But it remains largely vulnerable to shocks. Also, we know that the machinery sector is dependent on the growth of the automobile sector and other means of transport, for which demand has been severely hit globally. So the graph also shows that all sectors have experienced their largest fall in imports in the second quarter of 2020. Actually, our data shows that the fall in imports started in February 2020 and registered the sharpest negative peak in April. Also, we know that in March, Tunisia had a lockdown for 1 month for all workers, except for some sectors like health and the food sector. So now if we distinguish between consumption and intermediate products, we find that the drop occurred mainly on intermediates. In fact, this means that different sectors have not been able to access intermediate products, and therefore companies couldn't produce and export final products. And in this case, the drop in imports will also be reflected in the decline in exports. So this paper answers 3 questions. First, we want to know what imported products are vulnerable. So we have identified almost 800 vulnerable products belonging mainly to extractives, machinery, and the food sectors. We have also identified more than 100 essential products. So we see the definitions of these terms in the coming slides. Second, we want to know if Tunisia's import basket is highly sensitive to vulnerable imports. So we find that, in fact, it is, and that the impact of essential products outweighs that of vulnerable products. And finally, we assess the sensitivity of Tunisia's local industries to vulnerable imports. So we find that the industries that are negatively affected the most are oil refining, textiles, and chemicals. So in what follows, I will present the methodology and results. But before that, I will go through some studies that are related to this paper very quickly. So Fried and Bang studied the impact of Chinese supply disruptions, and they found that Tunisia is among the top affected countries. Here, the 2 first studies identify vulnerable products based on different products' characteristics. The presence of central exporters, the tendency of exporters of certain products to cluster in one region, and the existence of other alternatives for obtaining inputs from other countries. And the third study focuses on the diversification of partners or suppliers as a factor of resilience. So these 3 studies use input-output linkages to estimate the propagation of a shock. And in our paper, as we'll see, we use input-output linkages to answer the third research question. Okay, now we move on to the methodology. So our first step is to identify vulnerable products. And to do this, we use 3 metrics. The first one is market concentration. So here we want to know whether Tunisia's imports depend on a limited number of suppliers. Second, we consider the intensity of imports. So we use import RCA, which compares a product's share in Tunisia's imports to its share in the world imports. So intensity of imports indicates if there's a high demand on a specific product, and therefore in case of a supply disruption, the country will find difficulty to satisfy this high demand, at least in the short run. So the first 2 metrics are computed using international bilateral trade data from the ACI database. And finally, we consider essential products, and these are products necessary to cure or prevent COVID-19. So we merge 2 lists. The first is provided by the World Bank, and the second is the output of a joint work between WCO and WHO. So our second step is to define a first differences model. First, we run the base model as defined by the first equation. On the left-hand side, we have the total change in imports between 2019 and 2020. And on the right-hand side, we have the change in imports of vulnerable products. So vulnerable products here are based on the 2 first vulnerability metrics that we saw, which are concentration of partners and import intensity. And then we have the change in imports of essential products, represented here by Delta Med COVID-19. So in the second equation, we introduce an interaction variable, which is the number of restrictions. And these are restrictions imposed by partner countries due to COVID-19 on products imported by Tunisia. So to answer our final research question, we use an input-output framework to assess the direct and indirect exposure of Tunisia's local industries to the supply shock caused by COVID-19. So input-output linkages lead input-supply shocks to affect not only sectors that import vulnerable products, but also their customers, or in other terms, the downstream sectors that do not necessarily import these products. And so that's what we're trying to measure here. The data used for this step is the input-output matrix of Tunisia for the year 2015, which is the most recent year that is for which the data is available. So to do this, we go through 2 steps. First, we identify the direct shock, which is related to the lack of inputs in each industry. And this is simply a factor that includes the change in imports for industry J in time T, where T here can be months or quarters. And second, we measure the indirect shock propagating through downstream linkages as outputs of an industry are inputs to another. So these 2 equations are adapted from the work of Acemoglu et al. Published in 2016. So in what follows, we'll see the results of each step in our analysis. Here in figure 4, we try to characterize each sector based on the 2 first vulnerability indicators. So the concentration index shows that the agricultural sector includes the less diversified suppliers. And on the other hand, the machinery sector is the most diverse in terms of suppliers. However, the machinery sector has been severely affected by the pandemic, and this may be due to the fall in demand. So the textile sector shows the highest score for import intensity, but relatively high diversification of suppliers compared to other sectors. Also, imports related to extractive industries are not so diversified in terms of suppliers, and they show high import intensity. So here, figure 5 shows that the highest share of imported vulnerable products is composed of intermediates. Also, we know that intermediates represented 86% of Tunisia's imports in 2019. So figure 6 shows the top suppliers of vulnerable products. We can see that vulnerable imports related to extractive industries are mainly coming from Algeria. And in general, Algeria is Tunisia's main supplier when it comes to extractive industries. Also, we can see that France and Italy are among the top suppliers of vulnerable products. So here we have the results of the first differences model. We run the model using monthly then quarterly data, but the conclusions are the same. As we can see, all coefficients are significant, and we can see that the coefficient related to essential imports, here called delta med COVID-19, highly overweights the coefficient of vulnerable imports, called delta VN for vulnerable imports. So in column 3, when we interact the number of restrictions with the two variables, we also have significant results. Finally, this is the result of our input-output framework. So figure 7 shows the level of exposure of Tunisia's local industries to direct and indirect supply shock. So the exposure to direct supply shock is far more significant than the exposure to indirect shock. And this is maybe due to the high share of intermediate imports, as inputs are largely imported and not produced locally. So the industries that are most affected negatively by supply shocks are oil refining, chemicals, and textiles. For essential imports, the mechanical and electrical industry shows a significant negative exposure to the shock. Also, our data shows that essential imports are mainly consumption products belonging to machinery, chemicals, and textiles. So our results can be summarized in 5 points. We have identified vulnerable products based on concentration of partners and import intensity. And we also identified essential products related to COVID-19. So we find that intermediate products are more vulnerable than consumption products. Top sectors with vulnerable imports are extractives, machinery, and food. We also find that Tunisia's industries' indirect exposure to supply shocks is far less pronounced than direct exposure. And finally, we find that the top industries that are negatively impacted by COVID-19 supply shock are oil refining, textiles, and chemicals. So one of the limitations of our work is that we do not consider demand in our model specification. Okay, so it is important to understand the sources of vulnerability and the factors of resilience to find solutions, either national or international. For instance, at the national level, government intervention is needed to quickly address problems encountered by impacted sectors with a permanent dialogue between public and private representatives. And also at the bilateral and regional level, the trade agreements with Tunisia's main partners Specifically, the European Union should focus on supply chain sectors and especially on the alleviation of non-tariff barriers. So thank you for your attention. I hope the presentation was clear, and I'm open to your questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amal. A very, very interesting presentation indeed. I know there are not so many people in the audience right now, but are there any questions? Would you like to pose your questions? Please raise a hand or post your questions in a chat if you have any questions for Amal. I don't see any. Perhaps just Amal, if I may then take this opportunity. First of all, very, very interesting indeed. Just maybe one observation and maybe another question is just, I was wondering, because you don't explicitly showcase this in your presentation, whether there is an appearance of a relationship between the products which have high levels of value addition and whether these are less vulnerable to outside shocks or not. It would appear perhaps that is the case, but I just wondered if you actually looked at that particular aspect of the shocks. The other thing that was quite surprising in the data that you showed was there was not really a reliance on China in terms of for imports, and there's a very strong reliance on Algeria. And I was first of all wondering whether MacMap does capture some of the restrictions in Algeria. We know that China did have very high levels of restrictions, but since there wasn't that import dependence, whether this actually would influence perhaps some of the significance of your results, which appeared to be quite strong, that there's a relationship between restrictions and import change. But I was just wondering, how good the data was for MacMap on some of the markets that you're supplying from, and whether it would have been a very different picture than in your view with regard to China. But I also see that Bushra and Fusini have questions, so perhaps they can pose their questions too, and then you can feel free to answer. I can't see any hands up, that's why I couldn't see it. But Antoine, you mentioned that there are also questions.
No, just that Bushra and Fusini have the questions. This is just what I wanted to say.
Hi, I'm Bushra. Thank you, Amal, for the wonderful presentation. I raised my hand, but I don't know if there is a technical problem. Sorry about that. I have a question. I have two questions actually. One is I am wondering what is the data source of the trade restrictions imposed by the partner countries. And my second question is that it seems you are considering the trade restrictions imposed by the partner countries only and not considering the trade restrictions imposed by Tunisia itself, because that may be affecting the trade of Tunisia in a sense that the exporters are relying on the intermediate and raw materials, as your study shows that those product categories fall in vulnerability. Thank you.
Indeed, I can see the hands up now. Sorry, Fusini, would you like to also pose your question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick one. I'm wondering if there is a typo or not in the two equations you showed. In the second one, I think I saw the interaction terms, but for the number of restrictions, but I think the main term is missing. Am I correct? Maybe you can go back, please, to the slide where we have specifications. Okay. Maybe it is in the slide where you show the models actually. Okay, so they are in the results, but it seems to me that they are missing in the. Yes. So the main terms are missing in the specification, but we have them in the results. So maybe it's better to put them here as well. Because otherwise, as you know, we have
your second point.
Yes, the main terms, the number of restrictions is missing here in levels, the main term. But I saw that you have them in the results, but they are absent here. So we should have them.
They are level. Here in equation 2.
Yes, but they are absent in levels. We don't have. We have only the interaction terms. We don't have the main term.
Okay. Yeah. I get it. Yeah.
It's just a typo, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Amal, I think these were the only questions so far. Would you like to answer?
Okay. So maybe if we start by, okay, so the remark on the sectors that are participating in backward GBCs for Tunisia, which are mainly the machinery and the textiles sector. So maybe this figure shows, actually we didn't have specific analysis for these sectors with high value added, but maybe this figure can show us that, for instance, the machinery sector comes in the second place after the extractive industries for the products that are vulnerable for Tunisia. And the textile sector comes in the fourth place. For the relation with China, actually, we our results do not show China in the top countries that are that are affecting Tunisia. That the supply shock caused in this country is affecting Tunisia. So for us, and it seems like a bit logical because Tunisia's main partners are mainly in the European Union, France, Italy, Germany. So specifically these countries. And for extractive industries, it's a bit like a specific case because we mainly import extractive industries from Algeria. And in a second place, Italy, but the gap is large, so mainly from Algeria. That's why here we appear to be largely impacted by the supply shock in Algeria. For the questions raised by Bushra, so Bushra, thank you for the remark about the trade restrictions imposed by Tunisia. So actually, we didn't include them because they don't exist. So in the period we are studying, the effect of COVID-19, which is between 2019 and 2020, Tunisia did not impose any restrictions, nor on imports, nor on exports. So that's why we don't include them. And for the data sources for the trade restrictions, I presented them here. For the trade restrictions, so I didn't present them. Okay, sorry for that. So the data sources for that are MacMap, so the ITC data. Okay, so I believe these are the points that are raised. Maybe if I missed something, you can remind me.
I think you answered all the questions. Any follow-up? We have a couple of minutes. Are there any follow-up questions? No, I don't think so. So indeed, well, no, I think that's good. So thank you very, very much, Amal, for the presentation. It was really very, very interesting. Thanks again.
Sure. Thank you so much.
Okay, so we'll move to our next speaker now. So our next presenter is Justine Mogendi, a lecturer at the University of Nairobi since 2019. and she'll be presenting on the effects of COVID-19 on international trade and post-recovery strategies in Kenya. So whenever you're ready, Justine Mogendi, the floor is yours. Justine, are you here?
I don't see him in the participants list. So if he's not here, maybe we can move on to the next presenter and then get back to him. We can wait for a few minutes.
Okay. Yes, sorry. Yes, I didn't see. Indeed, I cannot see him. Well, perhaps we move on to the next presenter, and then we can, we can come back to him, as you say. So our next presenter will be Zameelah Jaffur from the University of Mauritius. So nice to meet you. He will be presenting on the impact of global COVID-19 pandemic on FDI and presenting evidence from a small open economy. So whenever you're ready, Zameelah, please go ahead and present.
Greetings, everyone. Okay, I'm Zameelah Jaffur from University of Mauritius. Okay, I'll just share my slide.
And we can see your slides. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just start it. Yes. Okay.
Yes, correct. Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, my presentation topic will be about the impact of the global COVID-19 pandemic on foreign direct investment flows, evidence from a small open economy. In particular, I will focus on the small island Mauritius, situated in the Indian Ocean. First of all, I would like to thank organizers for giving me this opportunity to present at this conference, and thank the co-authors, Professor Bhupen Stana, Associate Professor Virena Tandanyan-Rabuga, Dr. Shirin Fazel, and Dr. Virian Tiruvengada. Here is a brief outline of what will be discussed in the presentation. I will start with a brief overview of foreign direct investment flows, in particular in Mauritius. This will be followed by the objectives of the study, and then the data and methodology used for this study. Then I will focus on the discussion of the research findings, and finally, I will end up with the conclusion drawn from this specific study and some policies emanating from the findings of this study. Yes, foreign direct investment has been severely hit worldwide by the COVID-19 pandemic, and it has fell by 35% to reach $1 trillion at the end of 2020, compared to $1.5 trillion in 2019. Both developed and developing economies were affected. For the specific case of developing economies, foreign direct investment flows decreased by approximately 8%, mainly because of resilient flows in Asia. In the specific case of Africa, foreign direct investment flows fell by 16% to $40 billion, the lowest since 2005. Without doubt, Mauritius was not spared, and it accounted to a decline of 48% in foreign direct investment flows in 2020 for the period of investigation, January 2020 to June 2020. And for the countries of origin of investment, this decline ranges from 37.1% to 99.1%. As for the main sectors of investment, this ranges from 52% to 100% decrease in the construction sector. Consequently, these are the main research objectives. Our main objective is to examine the impact of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic on the foreign direct investment flows in Mauritius. In particular, will provide an in-depth analysis in terms of the main geographical origin and main sectors of investment. In this context, we will apply the newly developed Bayesian structural time series framework for causal analysis in order to assess the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the foreign direct investment flows in Mauritius. Coming to the data that we have used for this specific study, we have particularly used monthly gross direct investment flows for the period January 2014 to June 2020, and the data was extracted from the Bank of Mauritius. First of all, we consider 11 main countries of origin of investment and 7 sectors. And this sample of countries and sectors were then reduced after an initial analysis. With respect to the data, this is a brief overview of the data of foreign direct investment flows for the specific country, Mauritius. Here we can see that for the period January to June 2020, here, these are the values that have been collected for this specific period as compared to this period itself in 2019, we can see that there is an overall decrease in terms of geographical origin of investment. In particular, we have found that for France, it accounted to 37.3% decrease. As for China, it accounted to 99.1%. Surprisingly, we have also seen that investment from the United States of America had a considerable increase here. As you can see in the table. With respect to the sectors of investigation, we have seen that overall, we can see for the 3 sectors, overall, there's an increase having observed here. But more or less, we can find decrease in the construction sector, the information communication sector, and real estate activities sector. More precisely, we have found that the construction sector was the most affected by the pandemic. One question that arises here is whether these changes in the foreign direct investment flows in terms of geographical origin of investment and sector of investment, whether this is due to the outbreak of the pandemic that occurred in December 2019, or whether these were because of other structural changes. To this end, we'll apply the Bayesian structural time series framework for causal analysis as mentioned earlier. In order to apply the Bayesian structural time series framework, we'll have to follow a 2-step procedure based on previous empirical studies using this particular methodology. First of all, we will adopt an autoregressive integrated moving average model to determine first some control variable that will be used for causal analysis here. That is, will determine which countries and sectors will be used as synthetic control. One will be applying the Bayesian structural time series model for the estimation of the causal impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the foreign direct investment flows, be it in terms of the country of origins of investment and the sector of investment. I will just go briefly on how we implemented the 2 different steps. For the first step, the ARIMA framework. First of all, we'll break our sample, the January 2014 to June 2020, into 2 different samples here. The first sample will consist of data known as the pre-COVID-19 period, that is before December 2019, would be called the pre-COVID-19 period, and those of the that is January 2020 to June 2020 would be called as the post-COVID-19 period. What we'll be doing here, we have estimated the ARIMA model for each series using the data from the pre-COVID-19 period. We'll use it to forecast for each series in the absence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Then we'll compare the prediction between the different series from the real values and the prediction that we obtain from the ARIMA models. And the series that will have the least disparity between the prediction and real values will be considered as suitable control for the implementation of the Bayesian structural time series framework for causal analysis. With regard to the application of the second step here for the application of Bayesian structural time series model, first of all, we'll have to fix for an intervention event here. In our case, the intervention event will be the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it had occurred, it was first declared in December 2019. So this would be our event here, December 2019 would be our intervention point. And then we'll use the pre-intervention period data, that is from January 2014 to December 2019, to find an optimal Bayesian structural time series model for each series. And we'll use this series to provide forecast again for the post-intervention period in the absence of the pandemic. Then we'll use the control variable, the control country or sector that we have identified in the first step to estimate the causal impact of the pandemic by subtracting the real values of the series from the counterfactual scenarios for the post-intervention period, that is for the period January 2020 to June 2020. I will now move on to the findings of the ARIMA results. Briefly, from the ARIMA framework, we have found that these are the predicted gross direct investment flows for January to June 2020, what we have obtained as prediction. If we compare it with the original values, we see that overall a decline can be noted except for some sectors. But for the purpose of our study here, we'll consider India and the wholesale and retail trade sector as control variable to apply the second step, that is to apply the Bayesian structural time series framework for causal analysis. I will just go briefly on the cumulative effect here from the result of the Bayesian structural time series framework, the result that we have obtained upon estimating these models. In terms of geographical region of investment, we can see that it is significant only for 5 countries, namely for South Africa, Switzerland, Belgium, China, and Reunion Island. In all cases, the models have shown that there is a considerable decrease in foreign direct investment flows, and this was due evidently of the outbreak of the pandemic declared in December 2019. For South Africa, we have seen that a 45% decrease have been observed. And as for China, we have observed a 99% decline. Despite that, for the other countries, the results were not significant, but for some cases, it was positive and negative. The probability of a causal effect denoted by these underlying figures were obviously higher than 50%. And this probability here shows that in the long run, evidently, most probably the COVID-19 pandemic will affect foreign direct investment flows emanating from these countries. But this will depend on the policies implemented by the government to mitigate the spread of the virus across the island. Coming to the sectors of investigation, here for the cumulative effect, again, here for the sectors, we have found that only the real estate activity sectors were significantly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in our case. 31% decrease have been observed. But surprisingly here, as we have found from the ARIMA model itself, the manufacturing sector recorded a considerable increase in the foreign direct investment flows here. Again, here, if we have a look at the probability of the causal effect, they are well above 50% in all cases, suggesting that the COVID-19 pandemic in the long run will surely affect investment flows in these sectors. But once again, this will depend on the policies implemented by the government to mitigate the effect of the pandemic in the country. Here are some of the conclusions drawn from the research. Upon an initial examination, we have found that there was a change in the figures of the gross direct investment flows for the period of investigation, that is January 2020 to June 2020, as compared to the previous year, that is 2019. And we have then followed a two-step procedure to apply the Bayesian structural time series framework for causal analysis. And from the ARIMA model, we have seen that indeed there has been a change in the flows for this specific period compared to the previous year. In particular, we have found that direct investment flow series indeed departed from its actual trend 2 months after the declaration of the pandemic in December 2019. And for the Bayesian structural time series framework for causal analysis, the results have shown that it has a negative effect on investment for only 5 countries investigated, namely Belgium, China, South Africa, Switzerland, Northern Ireland, and for the sector, only the real estate activity sector was negatively affected. Surprisingly, again, here we have found from the result that a positive and significant influence were observed for the manufacturing sector. Consequently, these are some of the policies emanating from the findings of our study. The government could work with industries and sectors that are highly impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic to develop resilient strategies and help them reimagine their business models. Government should also diversify operations and spread facilities across the region by increasing participation in global value chains. Mauritius should also broaden the cycle of opportunities by capitalizing on market access arising from the free trade agreements with China, the preferential trade agreement with India, and that with Africa, and also energize multilateral cooperation on investment, particularly on matters related to investment governance. Government should also maintain a legal and regular framework that will keep Mauritius highly ranked on ease of doing business, together by maintaining good government indices. This is what I have for the presentation. Thank you for your attention, and I will be open for any further comments and questions with respect to this presentation. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, Zameelah, for the presentation. It's very interesting. Raises a lot of questions, I think, for policymakers. Are there any questions from the audience that's listening? Please raise your hand if you have any. I don't see any in the chat. Yes, Husseini.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a quick technical question. So I'm wondering, did you try another type of causal model in the second step? Because in the first step, you are using an ARIMA, so this is a classical frequentist approach. Mm-hmm. And in the second step, you are using a Bayesian model. I didn't see the specification of the model, but if it is a Bayesian model, so it's based on another set of assumptions. So in terms of statistical philosophy, they are completely different. So do you think of using either a Bayesian approach in the first step or using a classical approach in the second step?
Yeah, with respect to that question, for the application of the Bayesian structural time series framework for causal analysis, basically we have to follow, based on previous study, they have followed a 2-step procedure. But first, they have applied the ARIMA model for the main series, that is in order to identify a control variables. For our case, we have used the ARIMA model in order to identify a particular control variable. Like I have mentioned, for the country of origin, we have used India, and that for the sectors, we have used the wholesale and retail trade sector. And then using this model, we have we have applied. Maybe I have omitted mentioning it when applying the Bayesian structural framework here. When applying the Bayesian structural framework for causal analysis, we have to use this series as control variable when we are estimating the model, so that we can have a very good effect, whether it is the effect is due to the COVID-19 pandemic or other structural changes. I hope that I have answered your question, maybe.
Yes, so maybe my point will be, yes, but you can use also a Bayesian approach to do what you did with the ARIMA.
Yeah.
Then you have a Bayesian approach, because if you use a frequentist approach, you are assuming that the true value of a parameter is fixed, but in a Bayesian framework, it is a random variable. So they are very different in terms of statistical approach. That was just my point, but it's okay.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Foussini, for your intervention and your comments too. Are there any other questions or comments from the audience? Antoine? Where?
Yeah, I was surprised by the large augmentations of FDI from US to Mauritius in 2020. Do you have an explanation coming from fiscal regulations adopted in the US, or maybe a big operation, a big investment operated by a unique company, a US company or something like this?
We have gone into investigating where these investment flows came from, but we have not found any solid explanation about it, because the investment from US was large enough, was large before the pandemic itself. We have not had any solid evidence about whether it was due mainly to because of the pandemic, because our results have shown that it was not due to the pandemic, because the results was not significant in our case for this specific time of investigation.
Okay, so I think that you should try to find this explanation, because I think it's important with such big statistics compared to the others. I think you must find an explanation. It is just an advice. Thank you.
Thanks.
If I don't see any other questions, actually, I actually a follow-up to Antoine's as well. I was also maybe not too surprised by the US investment. Maybe it's also to take advantage of AGOA's preferences. And of course, Mauritius is a big exporter through South Africa to the US market, and it's in the manufacturing sector. So I think it's perhaps related to textiles. But indeed, it would be interesting to know the number, because the number would influence that as well. I also, just generally, as knowing a little bit about the Mauritian economy, FDI outside of the real estate sector is virtually insignificant. And so when you're looking at the changes, these are from very, very small bases. And so I'm wondering really whether they're very significant results that we're looking at, and whether we can control for that, because in some cases it really is going from 1 to 2, so it's showing 100% increase. But what is the value? I did see in your table there were no values to the flows, and so I'm not sure if they're in millions or billions of dollars. So that's another issue. And so I just think in terms of for the policymakers, for the implications of what you've looked at, indeed knowing the number of projects and not just the value of the flows, if that's feasible to obtain, it would be very interesting. And just finally, also, why is it that some countries have significantly decreased investments into Mauritius? Again, I think of South Africa, it's because of the real estate business taking a dive. But I'm just wondering if we could understand why some countries didn't disinvest during this period, and that would be helpful to understand perhaps what would be the policy response to that. That would be quite interesting.
Yes, thanks for raising this point. Maybe I will try to investigate further about the explanation behind these significant changes, how most probably they are related to the sectors investigated itself.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
There was a question, I think, in the chat that came up from Bushra. Did you control for the demand side of
no
in the model?
Yes, we have not to control for the demand side here. We have just do only a direct impact here of the COVID-19 pandemic on the series. We have not do any specific regression control and so on.
Okay, very good. Any follow-up, Bushra, to that response?
Maybe the demand side can be investigated because we are actually working on another part of this project with, on the effect, that is disaggregating the effect further. Maybe we'll be considering the demand side when we'll be using regression model to account for the effect here.
Okay, I think we have satisfaction from the audience. Good, you're making my life very easy in terms of timekeeping, or at least the host's life very easy in terms of timekeeping. So yes, nothing more to say on this before we move to the next speaker? No? Okay, well, so thank you very much, Zameelah. Thank you for the presentation. And very interesting, and also to your colleagues, of course, at University of Mauritius.
Thanks.
Good. So I believe now that Justine Mogendi is on the line. Again, lecturer at the University of Nairobi, and will be presenting on the effects of COVID-19 on international trade and post-recovery strategies in Kenya. So Justine, if you're available, please take the floor.
Thank you, Paul. I hope I'm audible enough.
We can hear you well, thank you.
Thank you. Let me share my. I believe the PowerPoint seen.
Yeah, we can see it. Not in full slideshow mode, but yes, we can see it. Yes, now we can. Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So thank you, everyone, for this opportunity to present this paper. It's actually a big paper we did during the period of COVID-19 in 2021 with a team of members from the WTO's Chairs Group, which is under the Department of Economic and Development Studies at the University of Nairobi. It's actually right now a book. It's to be published. So it's actually a collection of so many papers. They're like around 8. So basically, what I will do in this presentation is just to give highlights of each element what we were discussing. So the outline of this presentation also follows how the report is in terms of the topic. So first of all, we began by looking at the global macroeconomic trends and performance in the face of the pandemic. Then we looked at the East African countries' trade patterns, that is products, services, patterns. We analyzed how it affected the East African countries, the COVID. Then we looked at the COVID-19 measures, basically those which were in line to trade. That's why we call it the non-tariff barriers to trade. Then we looked at trade facilitation measures during COVID-19, some of the measures that were taken. Then there was some series of empirical papers which analyzed the impact of COVID-19 on merchandise trade, on services sector, on FDI, on SMEs, and informal cross-border trade. Then we analyzed some of the economic recovery measures that were taken during COVID-19. So in this presentation, I'm just going to give a brief outline, a brief review of these elements. Now, in terms of the global macroeconomic trends, what we observed during the study period, COVID-19 adversely affected the macroeconomy through GDP, employment, and inflation. Those are the main indicators, the macro indicators that COVID-19 actually affected. In Kenya, for example, GDP decreased by around 0.3% in 2020 due to the invasion of COVID-19, and debt to GDP ratio increased by around 8%. And some of the trends that we saw in Kenya were actually some of the same trends happening in East Africa and Africa, and also globally. Like global GDP decreased by around 3%, which is also reflected also in Kenya. Now, in terms of the East African countries, what we observed is that both exports and imports apparently of goods increased in the East African region, the exports and imports of goods. But then on services, exports of services decreased with a very big percentage, especially the travel services. Travel and tourism were actually the most affected by COVID-19, but then other business services massively increased, especially the businesses which were conducted through digital platforms. Now, some of the measures that the country took, which when we go ahead, you'll see these measures are actually the one which affected trade with a big margin, was closures of borders to movement of person. These were measures that were taken as early as March 2020. There were closure of borders to movement of persons, mandatory COVID-19 screening at the borders, 14-day quarantine of new arrivals, closure of non-essential businesses, curbing meetings and social gathering, night curfews, and embargoes or bans on some vaccines. Now, what these measures resulted to was an increase in international trade costs, and world trade actually decreased. Now, but by measuring in terms of Kenya, there was so much traffic snarl-ups and slowdown of logistic flows that were caused by the closure of borders. So at the border, health checks had to be done compulsory, and this one caused traffic snarl-up and delay of movement of commodities. There were also shortages of essential commodities, which were caused by an increase in demand for pharmaceutical products. Then something that we observed, the restriction of exportation of any reagents for Roche and abort machines by the US government led to a scale down of COVID-19 testing in Kenya. That is something that we observed that was very significant. But in general, these non-tariff barriers actually disrupted supply chains in the country. But then Kenya's other government also took some trade facilitation measures. For example, the government banned importation of second-hand clothes till measures were put in place on how to disinfect them and transport them. But this ban also was later lifted in the late year 2020, towards the end of 2020, that is. Some of the measures also that the government did, it supported and promoted businesses by procuring and buying goods and services from them. That is investing directly in the economy. It channeled money locally through small businesses and ensured that technology and know-how is made available to SMEs and companies. The government also through customs implemented the single window system, which is an ICT system that integrates all trade facilitating agencies at the business community with Kenya Revenue Authority. And then this Kenya Revenue Authority, which is the authority that manages taxation, collecting of taxes, it made sure that clearing agents and transporters and importers were issued with authorized economic operator certificates, which ensure that 70% of the cargo is cleared at the port. Some of the key agencies, trade agencies like Trademark East Africa, they implemented measures which included the reduction of custom clearance documents from 10 to 20 on imports, and for exports, the documents reduced actually from 9 to 5. All these were some of the trade facilitation measures that were also adopted by these trade agencies. And also, and TIMEA also, the Institute of Export and International Trade, signed an MOU to implement the digital trade corridor between Kenya and the UK as one of the trade facilitation measure. But then on the multilateral level, Kenya is still implementing various trade facilitation measures, among them custom valuation agreements, agreements of pre-shipment inspection, and import licensing procedures. Now, empirically now, some of the empirical studies that were conducted, the first one was to actually analyze the impact of COVID-19 on merchandise trade. The strategy that was adopted was actually to break down the pandemic into two aspects, the spread and the government measures. We wanted to see which one had a larger impact. Is it the spread of the virus? And when you say the spread, is other nations' response to the virus, if that is what affected our trading, or if it's our own government measures that affected trade more. What we saw is that the spread did not have a larger impact compared to the government measures. In other words, the measures that were taken by our government were the ones which actually affected trade more than what other countries did, like closing their borders and affecting the shipment. That effect was not large compared to what our government did. In terms of exports, the spread caused a decline of exports of around 0.47%, but the government measures caused a decline of 0.6%. Now, most of the goods that were affected were consumer goods. Exports actually decreased, followed by industrial supplies and then food, beverages. But on the government measures, exports of transport equipment decreased by over 50% during that period of government restriction measures. In terms of imports, the spread had a lower impact. Fuel and lubricants were the ones which actually decreased by around 37%. And this one was definite because we import a lot of oil and fuel products from countries which actually closed their borders during the period of COVID-19. This one reduced the imports of fuel by around 37%. But apparently consumer goods increased during that period of COVID-19 by around 23%. This was a reflection of low domestic production in the country during that period of COVID-19. But generally, the government of Kenya's response had a larger effect than the spread itself. Of course, definitely over 2021, some of these measures, in fact, most of these measures were lifted. In terms of service sector, the effect actually of COVID-19 was more intense in the service sector of the economy. In fact, in the second quarter of 2020, the country recorded a contraction of around 5.5%, which was translating into a 0.5 decrease in the growth rate for the first half of 2020 on the service sector. The contraction was attributed to the containment measures like movement restrictions, border closures, ban on international travel, closure of education institutions, and reduction of public transportation capacity. This caused a lot of contraction of the service sector. Further measures were stay and work from home orders, banning of public gatherings in places of worship, hotels, and bars. All these caused the contraction of the service sector. The measures affected the main sectors that contribute to the country's GDP, like tourism services, manufacturing, retail trade, and the hotel industry transportation. These are the main sectors which contribute to the GDP of our country, and these measures actually had a large impact on these measures. Now, the restriction translated into reduced income, hurting both business owners and their employees. And the short-term economic impact translated into a decrease in the long-term growth prospects for the country. Most of the firms actually in the sector experienced decline in their sales and had to adjust labor in terms of layoffs or reduced wages and hours due to the pandemic. So the economy of the country was so much affected through the channel of the service sector. In terms of FDI, COVID led to a severe decline in FDI's inflows to Kenya. Kenya's inward FDI was $770 million US dollars in 2020, compared to 1.3 billion in 2019. What we observe is that the pandemic introduced local participation requirements in various industries like insurance, telecommunications. Now, this local participation, they led to a disadvantage. They disadvantaged the country in terms of competing to attract FDI. this is something that we observed during that period of study. The pandemic affected the sources of FDI with greenfield investment, almost cutting to half, and project finance fell by around 2/3. Then FDI again, as an element, could still play a pivotal role during and after the pandemic in supporting these economies through financial support to their affiliates and linkages to local funds. These are some of the observations that we made and recommended to our government. Now, most outcomes will depend on the success or otherwise of the public health measures, especially the effectiveness in containing COVID-19. In terms of cross-border trade, now cross-border, the way we defined cross-border, informal cross-border, informal in our setup in the country, it just involves traders crossing the border with goods loaded on their heads, especially through Uganda and Tanzania. This informal cross-border trade is actually so huge, it forms a huge chunk of trade in the country. This cross-border actually they can walk, they can use bicycle, hand carts, wheelchairs. There's a lot of cross-border trade, informal cross-border trade happening in the country. Now, this informal cross-border trade provides essential income to many livelihoods. Majority of the participants in this trade are actually women, who make up to around 70%. Now, the introduction of border restrictions and regulations during the period affected the informal cross-border trade activities between Kenya and her neighbors, especially Uganda. For example, there was a significant shift from informal to formal trade on weekly average of trade volumes for rice and maize at Zameelah border between Kenya and Tanzania. During this study, there were two platforms of debate where the government was in the position like this restriction also enhanced formal trade, which is, to the government perspective, it's more encouraged. But then on the welfare part, the argument was the livelihoods of the people who were involved in informal cross-border trade were actually negatively affected. There were disruptions of the shipment of fresh food under COVID-19 restrictions. So this created food shortages at the point of demand and wastages at the point of production due to surpluses. Then this enhanced COVID restriction, what we saw is that they intensified bribes and illicit fines and created more checkpoints along the corridor nodes. The numerous checkpoints also caused significant time delays, leading to briberies. In fact, by April 2020, the illicit collections and bribes had increased by around 50%. The limited movement also complicated the shipment of goods and services by traders on the other side of the border. Some will therefore resort to paying truck drivers to buy and transport goods on their behalf. Now, some possible way forward recommendations that we made for the government, which also, most of them, we gave this report to the government. Some of these measures were taken, but some of the policies that we gave or recommendation were, in terms of FDI, there was a need to increase investment and innovation in ICT infrastructure. COVID-19 actually exposed the country in terms of the deficiency in ICT structure. There's a need to invest in electricity and internet connectivity for sustainable use of ICT. And also there was a need to facilitate development of digital skills by scaling up digital innovations in education and skill development sector. There was also need to strengthen legal and policy framework to support uptake of e-commerce. Most of these recommendations in terms of FDI were targeting the digital platforms, because the digital platform is actually the one that showed a lot of potential of growth and stability for the country. In terms of local tourism, there was a need to incentivize local tourism, to design products and review pricing strategies so as to promote tourism, which was adversely affected by COVID-19. In terms of informal cross-border, the way forward, government authorities should develop a simplified step-by-step guides for small cross-border traders. There was a need for a guide to actually help these informal cross-border traders. There's also a need to make efforts to widen the scope of guidelines to facilitate movement of merchandise across the borders. And there was also a need to encourage mobile banking and cashless payment systems among these traders. Then there was also a need for the government to design a system that can be used to capture informal cross-border trade data, because finding this data was actually not easy. It's not easy to document this data, and there was a need for the government to actually develop a design or a structure that can capture the data of informal cross-border trade. Then there's a need for more appropriation information and custom regulation to protect the small-scale traders. In terms of trade facilitation, the way forward now, of course, there were trade facilitation measures that were already implemented, but these ones were way forward, more of advising what more can be done. There was
Justin,
need to
we
open.
have 2 minutes to go.
Okay, sorry. There was need to open more special counters and relays and smart gates to provide round-the-clock clearance at critical points. Maybe I can skip that one and just talk in terms of economic recovery strategies. In terms of strategies, the economic recovery strategies, the recommendations were in terms of medium strategies and long-term strategies. In terms of medium, there was a need for continuation of the economic stimulus programs, such as tax reductions, giving temporary basic incomes to workers who had been laid off. There was a need for subsidizing essential goods, such as food, electricity, kerosene, and there was also a need to actually adopt job retention programs. In terms of long-term strategies, there's a need to promote local production, leverage on technology, economic diversification, trade facilitation, and aid for trade. So in conclusion, and some of the recommendations, there was a need to accelerate the rate of investment in electricity connectivity, digital tools, and infrastructure. There was also a need to strengthen technical regulation and develop and implement standards that were conformity, that will actually provide enabling infrastructure for industries to grow. Then there was a need to reduce behind-the-border regulation that act as restrictions to trade in services. And finally, there's a need to pursue policies and strategies that support and sustain farms, individuals, and households in the long run, mid-term, and short term. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin, for this interesting presentation. A lot of information that you've provided, many different angles that you're looking at things. I see that Antoine Bouet has a first question that he would like to answer. So over to you, Antoine.
Thank you very much, Chairman, Mr. Chairman. Thank you. Congratulations, Justine. This was really interesting. I mean, it covered a lot of topics which are really important. I was just wondering if you have, I think that you have maybe a restrictive definitions of informal trade. This is my point of view, because you consider only trade in small quantities. If I understood you, what you said, well, I'm not sure, but this is what I understood. And if it is the case, I think that there is also smuggling, which is not recorded by definition, and also, you know, when there is trade which is declared at the customs to custom officials, maybe there is misclassification or undervaluations of exports in order to pay less taxes, or and so I think that maybe informal trade is not well defined. And you mentioned informal trade at Isebania between Kenya and Tanzania. And I think that your statistics comes from FuseNet. And I think that FuseNet has a different definition of informal trade, which is more, which is closer to the one I just mentioned. And I just want to say that simplified export declaration can help to formalize informal trade. But at the same time, I had the discussions 2 or 3 years ago with somebody from a representative from the Ministry of Commerce in Tanzania, also from EAC in Arusha, and they told me that it's good. It has a positive impact on formalizations of informal trade, but it is not sufficient because some informal traders are illiterate, and so they cannot fill even a simplified trade regime. And so they try to support the associations of informal traders that in order to make a declaration filled even when the traders is illiterate. So thank you. I'm done.
Thank you, Antoine. Perhaps we could just take another question from Mustapha, and then you can answer the question, Justine.
Yes, no, thank you very much, and congratulations, Justine. I think it's a very interesting presentation, and in fact, it's also several studies that were presented by Justine here, because it's part of a research project, funded also by the WTO with the support from France to analyze the effect of COVID-19 on international trade and post-recovery strategies in Kenya. So in fact, it's really a collection of papers that Justine here provided, which also help to really understand the state of the art, regarding the crisis, COVID-19 crisis in Kenya, but also in eastern part of Africa, and how Kenya has provided, very, let's say, urgent responses to address the COVID-19 crisis, but also longer term strategy, both in terms of trade policy and macroeconomic response, fiscal response, more particularly, which I think is very important. I just have maybe one question, not really a question, but also an observation for Justine. Maybe if you can provide a little bit more emphasis on the main results on trade and services, and how e-commerce has been impacted positively, I must say, in Kenya, and particularly the impact of the crisis as a way also to support and to boost B2B and B2C in terms of e-commerce platform, because Kenya has developed specific platforms as well, also in East African community. And I don't know if my colleague Andy is here, but I know that colleagues in ECA, SRO, and Simon also, who is in charge of this session with me today, did a lot of work. So it will be interesting maybe if Justine could just shed some light on this aspect. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, Justine, once more.
Over to you, Justin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mustapha, for the comments, and Antoine, for the good observations that you made. Maybe starting with Antoine. I agree. Our definition actually sounds to be very, very narrow of informal cross-border. Looking at just the movement, we didn't really analyze the aspect of smuggling, which also forms a big part of informal trade. Much of this analysis sometimes becomes complex because of data, the absence of data. But then there's a recommendation that you've made about the simplified declaration strategy that is being implemented. It's actually a good recommendation that we can also adopt in our review, and also try to analyze the workability of these strategies, and if they can work for our country, Kenya, and recommend to the right agencies. From staff, in terms of e-commerce.
Just, can I say something, Justine?
Yes.
So it's true that FuseNet gives statistics of trade between Kenya and Tanzania, and there is unrecorded trade and recorded trade, and I think that in unrecorded trade, most of it is trade in individual quantities, as you just defined it, but in order to evaluate what is not smuggling is difficult. There are very few initiatives that assess smuggling. There is some, but it's in West Africa, maybe between Congo and Rwanda. There is or Uganda. There is an initiative at the World Bank, but concerning misclassification or undervaluations at the customs, you can compare declarations by the exporting countries to declarations by the importing country. I'm done.
Thank you for that. Okay, so for the comment by Mustapha in terms of e-commerce, what we observed basically during that period of study is that there was a lot of shift. Basically, the shift was also promoted by the government. First of all, the government itself participated in also promoting these e-commerce shift. First of all, compelling workers to work from home, beginning from them themselves as the government. The private sector also following that idea of pushing everyone to work online, which up to now so many farms, even government, even our courts, they're doing their cases online. So there was a lot of shift to e-commerce that was actually triggered by the invasion of COVID. Even education, right? Even in universities right now, we have shifted to online teaching. So the e-commerce actual industry increased a lot since the invasion of COVID-19. This is something that is actually still on studies, the actual magnitude. But even just from the shift, the economic shift that we are seeing, the e-commerce actually has so much increased due to COVID-19.
Thank you very much, Justine, for the interaction as well with Antoine and Mustapha. Are there any other questions from others in the audience? I mean, I just have one perhaps, interesting insight that could have come out as well, particularly in light of the session discussion, would have been looking at international trade in services for Kenya and how they perhaps were impacted. So you looked at the impact on services output in GDP, but actually looking at how international trade in services was perhaps impacted by COVID. And in particular, if we start getting more granular, we know some service sectors are more impacted than others, but perhaps indeed the more digital or cross-border trade-oriented services perhaps were not so impacted. And I think that could be something that would have been interesting to investigate. And I think also, the struggle that you mentioned with regard to Kenya digitalizing in that period, it's something that I think many African countries felt, not just African, but the rest of the world as well, that switch that was necessary over that period. And indeed, seeing, what were some of the determinants that helped it move and shift, I think could have been very interesting. Just one question I had as well was with regard to the data that you used in terms of responses. When you analyzed the responses of other countries, I was wondering whether you used something like the IMF's database or you looked something like MacMap, as our previous speaker did. What kind of measures what database of measures were you looking at in terms of the responses of other countries and using that for your calculations of the impact that it had for Kenya?
Basically, for the other countries, we did use a lot of sources. We only used the trade statistics. Yeah, we only used the trade values in terms of imports and exports, especially China. What we import a lot, monthly imports, and then we're observing them for the period. Yeah, we only use the trade statistics to actually check the impact.
Okay, so more of a demand approach, how demand has fallen in those countries.
Yes,
okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you too.
Any more questions? I think not. This is your last chance. No. Okay, so thank you very, very much, Justine. Thank you for that very interesting presentation that raised a lot of discussion. So now we'll be moving on to the last presenter, Emmanuel Orkoh from the University of, actually, I'm not sure which university, so please let us know which organization you're associated with. You'll be presenting on the impact of firms' digital investments and resilience to shocks, evidence of the COVID-19 pandemic in Ghana. So very much looking forward to your presentation. Over to you, Emmanuel. We cannot hear you, Emmanuel. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I cannot hear you, Emmanuel, still.
I don't
Rimi?
hear Emmanuel. So.
We can see that Emmanuel is connected, but we cannot hear him.
Yeah, he looks connected. Let's take a minute. I'll reach out to him through the other app. I don't know if he's on call. Let's take a minute. I'll reach out to him. Thank you.
Thank you, Rimi.
Hello, Dr. Paul.
Hello, Emmanuel. Yes, we can hear you well now.
Yes, I was on the Hoover, and I think there was a problem with with that one.
Perfect now. We can hear you very well. Great. Would you like to share your screen as well, a presentation?
Yes, please. Okay. So I was saying that I'm affiliated with the Northwest University, South Africa.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm presenting on this firms' digital investment and resilience to shocks, evidence from the COVID-19 pandemic in Ghana. And I'm doing this paper together with my colleagues, Raymond Kofinti, Raymond Bodifrimpong, and Samuel Kobina Enim. In this presentation, I'll be looking at the introduction, data, and the variables that I used. And then I'll look at the estimation techniques, the results, and finally the conclusion and recommendations. So,
sorry, Emmanuel, may I just interrupt? Do you have a presentation you would like to project, or you wanted just to speak, because we can't see the presentation?
Oh, is it clear now? Can you see now?
No, we're just seeing you at this stage.
Hey, I have not shared. It seems I have not shared my screen. Sorry.
No. Perfect. We're getting there.
Perfect.
That's it. That's it. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you.
Yes, sorry. So as I said, I'm in this introduction, the presentation, I'll be looking at the introduction, the data that I used, and the variables are included in the models. Then I also look at the estimation techniques that I used to address the objective of the paper. I also look at the results, and finally the conclusion and recommendation. So okay. So economists have long emphasized the relevance of innovation for firms' performance. And in the work of Schoppinter, he emphasized the performance effects of technological adoption by firms and how it promotes entrepreneurship. The theoretical paradigms have influenced the empirical literature on technological adoption, utilization, innovation, and economic development. There have been several evidence of positive impact of digital technology on the adoption of, technical digital technology by firms and the impact on their performance. An example include their sales, export, and employment growth. This evidence gave us enough confidence that digital technology has come or is now known to be the major means by which firms are able to get connected with other and collaborate with other firms in order to enjoy economy of scale. But with the outbreak of the COVID-19 in 2019, there is the need for us to actually look at, validate the resilience of the potential effects of digital technology adoption by firms and how it affects their performance. So there have been several evidence of the effects of, the devastating impact of the COVID on firm performance all over the world. And evidence on the impact in Africa remains limited due to the high informal nature of businesses, activities, and lack of reliable data on the continent. However, a recent study on the lessons for MSCs emphasized digital payments, mobile money as critical digital transformation priorities for MSCs in the post-pandemic. So drawing on this paper, we decided to provide empirical assessments of the extent to which these recommendations hold in Africa, in Ghana, in Africa, but then using Ghana as the case study. We further explore the channels through which the potential impact is realized. So the data that we used was sourced from a balanced panel of COVID-19 business tracker survey conducted by the Ghana Statistical Service in the year 2020. That was the third quarter of 2020. And the survey, the sample frame was based on an earlier study, which is the Integrated Business Establishment Survey, and then the non-household businesses, which was also extracted from the Ghana Living Standard Survey, round 7. And the study used a two-stage stratified sampling approach with replacement. And the first stage involved the distribution of the enterprises across the 16 regions of the country, taking into consideration the size of the firm and the sector in which the firm operates. Then the second stage involved the selection of the firms from each stratum using a simple random sampling approach. Now, the survey measured the impact of COVID on the operation of businesses, labor force participation, business turnover, business outlook, and critical mitigation measures adopted by the businesses during the lockdown. Information on sales were collected. So in our study, our dependent variable of interest is sales of firms, because in the literature, different studies have looked at measured firm performance using different indicators, and some include growth of employment, business turnover, and profit. But in our case, we're restricted to only sales because that was the only variable that the survey or the Ghana Statistical Service collected. And the response rate was 76%. Ideally, Ghana Statistical Service targeted 5,000 enterprises, but they were only able to cover 4,311, constituting 76% response rate. But in our case, consistent observation for both our explanatory variable, which is the adoption of the use of internet service or mobile money platform for sales, and then the left-hand side variable, which is sales, where the consistent sample that we had was 3,744 firms. So for the 2 years, we got 7,548 firm year observation. As I've already indicated, explanatory variable of interest was the use of digital platforms, technologies for sales. So what we did as far as our estimation technique was concerned is that we first specified or estimated a pooled OLS as a baseline result, just to explore how the result will be. Then, so in this pool, with this pooled OLS technique, our left-hand side variable is the log of sales, and it's a function of the year plus the DI. DI is the dummy variable capturing whether the firm uses any of the technologies, and 0 otherwise. The year, we recorded the year in which the COVID occurred, which was 2020, and then as 1, and 0, that is the prior to the COVID, as 0. Then the firm characteristics include the age of the firm, or the experience, how long the firm has been operating, the gender of the owner of the firm, and then the sector of operation. So after we have estimated this pooled OLS, we go ahead to look at use the difference in difference approach to validate the reliability of our estimate. And so with the difference in difference, which is equation 2, we still have our log of sales on the left-hand side as a function of the year of the COVID, and then the dummy capturing the use of technology and the interaction term plus the firm characteristics. And the last component is the error term. Now, we suspect that firms that are likely to adopt digital technology or invest in digital technology are those who are who want to improve sales. At the same time, improving sales will also, compel firms to adopt digital technology. So this is a form of endogeneity which we expect, which is emanating from simultaneity. So we further go ahead and check the robustness of our estimate using a 2-stage instrumental variable model. And we use the district level digital investment adoption rate as our instrument to moderate the relationship between digital technology variable and our sales variable. After that, we go further to look at use the propensity score matching estimation technique to also look at to estimate the average treatment, so that we just want to check whether what we are having or what the result that we are, the parameter that we are having is not by accident. Then in our model, these are the variables that we included. In panel A, we have the log of sales and sales values, but then we use the log of sales in order to smoothen the variable or prevent any potential outliers that may bias our estimates. And in panel B, we have the year dummy there, COVID-19 year, which is 1 for 2020 and 0 for 2019. Then we have digital investment, whether the firm uses the digital investment or otherwise, and the district level variable that we use as our instrument. In panel C, we specify the characteristics of the firm that we included in the model. And in panel D, we look at panel D. Panel D provides the variables that we use as a channel to assess our impact. The channel through the channels through which we observe the impact. So we have whether the firm hired a new worker, whether the firm laid off workers, salary was reduced, hours worked were reduced, the firm worked at home during the lockdown, or they opened during the lockdown. So a brief description before we look at our regression result. We look at, in table 1, we look at the firm sales and digital investment. We observe that on average, in total, 44% of the firms had invested in digital development prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, and 56% did not have any digital investment. But in total, sales was 57,358 Ghana cedis for the total sample. And when we look at the firms that had invested and those that did not invest, we observed that those that, average sales was about a little above 70,000 Ghana cedis for those that invested, and a little above 47,000 for those that did not invest. When we look at the characteristics of the firm, we look at firms that have at least 50% of their managers being women, and we only see only 5% of those firms. And firms that have owners who are disabled, we're looking at inclusiveness. So that was only 7.5%, and manufacturing constituted about 37%, hospitality and food 5.4%, agriculture and other industry 4.4%, and trade, firms that engage in trade is 6.3%. When we look at the characteristics of, further characteristics, we look at the medium to large firms, and they constitute just 6.3%, and then young firms was 8.4%. Here, we mean young. The definition of young is a firm that has operated less than 5 years. And then we also have 64% of the firm had registered. So ownership was 81%. Limited liability was 9.2%. Firms that were owned by NGOs were 2.4%. Ghanaian owned was 98.4%. And exporting firms were 7.9%. Now we look at the distribution of sales across the firms that invested in digital technology and those that did not invest in digital technology. And what we observed is that in both the years prior to the COVID and the COVID years, firms that had invested in digital technologies, the sales was higher among firms that had invested in digital technologies than those that did not invest. In total, we found that, in fact, the difference in sales between in the year before the COVID, that was 2019, is about 56% between the firms that had invested in digital technology and the one that has not, and those that have not invested in digital technology. In the 2020, which was the COVID period, the difference reduced to about 45%. So we still see that difference. And considering the pooled data, when we pull everything together, the difference is around 52%. In figure 2, we look at the hiring during the COVID, and you observe that those firms that had invested in digital technology, the hiring rate was a bit slightly higher than those that did not invest in digital technology. And when we look at reduced hours of work, we observe that more percentages, higher percentage of firms that had invested in digital technology had, hours reduced, work hours reduced. And then working from home, relatively higher percentage of firms that had invested in digital technology work from home compared to those that did not invest in digital technology. And then the open during the lockdown, we also observed that those that had not invested in digital technology were more likely to open compared to those that had invested in digital technology. So it tells us that those that had invested in digital technology prior to the COVID had some flexibility, were able to work from home and also save some time or some hours of work. Now we look at our regression result, and our baseline result here. We present the pooled result for the 2 years together, and then we present separate result for 2009, which is the 2019, which is the pre-COVID year, and 2020, which is COVID year. In each of the models, A is on standardized coefficient, and then B is a standardized coefficient. So in this, we'll focus on the standardized coefficient for ease of interpretation. We observed that in the COVID year, sales reduced by about 21% or 22%. And in fact, digital investment contributed to about 14% as firms that had sales among the digital firms that had invested in digital technology was about 14% more than those that had not invested in digital technology. And we observed this result consistently across the models for the separate years. Now, with our difference in difference, our focus is our interacted term, which is the COVID year times the the product of the COVID year and the digital investment variable. And we observe that there's an increase of about 5%, which is and it's significant at 7% level. When we go to our two-stage least square, which is the instrumental variable, we observe the same consistent result, that digital investment, in fact, increases sales, even in the face of the COVID-19. And our first stage estimation here, which is a validation that the instrument that we use, which is a district level adoption of digital technology, is significant in influencing the adoption by firms. Now, our other estimation, which is the propensity margin approach, we use 5 classes of propensity margin, which is the nearest neighbors margin, 1-to-1, and then the general nearest neighbors, radius, kernel, and then local linear. And we observe that the results are all consistently and they are strongly significant in telling us that, in fact, adoption of digital technology or investment in digital technology help the firms to remain resilient in the face of the COVID-19 outbreak and its associated restrictions. Now, here we conduct sensitivity analysis to look at the differences of the result, taking into consideration the characteristics of the firm. So we observed that we didn't see, considering our difference in, the interactive term, none of them is significant. So we didn't find anything across the firms. But with digital technology as a separate variable, we see the significant result for manufacturing, hospitality, and then trade. When we look at it across the size of the firm, we observe that the results are significant for small-scale firms, weakly significant for small-scale firms. So it means that if the small-scale firms are encouraged and other factors put in place to enable them invest in digital technology, use digital technology, they stand to benefit more. Now we look at the performance of the across the owner of the gender of the owner of the firm, and we observe that the result is more significant for male managers, managers compared to female managers, and this result is not surprising in the sense that evidence show that male are more likely to adopt and use digital technology compared to females. So it still tells us that there's a problem. There's the need for policymakers to take into consideration the gender dimension of digitization in developing countries in general, and Ghana in particular. Now, performance across age of the firm, we also observe that the established firms, the result was more significant for established firms compared to young firms. And those for the formality, that is formal and informal, we do not see significant result for the interactive term, but then the investment in digital technology, we consistently see the significant result across the models. Now, we look at whether the firm, in my initial introduction or during the methodology, I said that we had either mobile money or use of internet platforms. So we include each of these as separate variables to assess the.
Emmanuel, you have 2 minutes to go.
Okay, I'm almost done. We have to assess their independent effects, and we observe that in each of the models we find significant result for when we plug each of them into the model. Then finally, we look at the channel of effects using just running the our results on taking into consideration whether the firm hired workers paid or consistently that our channel of effect firms that hired hiring more having digital technology together with hiring more workers improve the sales of the firm. Also laying off and decreasing salary, working at home all have significant effect on the firm's sales. Now, in conclusion, what we observe is that digital investment significantly improves firms' performance during the COVID-19 related demand and supply shocks. And then we also observe complementary effect of mobile money platforms and internet services. So the effects that we observe are also sensitive to the size of the firm, gender of the firm, firm's managers, and formality. But as I said, in fact, we have to revise this side because we didn't find significant for the formality. And we also observe the hiring of new workers, downsizing, reducing salary of workers, and working from home are all potential channels through which firms could, digital investment could influence sales of firms. Now, our recommendation, what we say is that firms need to increase their digital investment and diffuse digital platforms into their operations to complement the effort of government and development partners towards building a resilience and also recovery of their economies. But on the side of policymakers, we also say that they should also make internet data affordable to firms because it is possible, or there's evidence that in developing countries, cost of data is very high, which scare firms and individuals from even using the internet for productive activities. And finally, government should provide complementary infrastructure such as electricity and ICT to promote the use of digital technology by firms in Ghana and other developing countries. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very, very much, Emmanuel. Very interesting, nice evidence that you've got there in terms of the importance of digitalization. You're going to be the darling, I think, of Microsoft and IBM in the future. Thanks very much. Are there any, there was a question actually in the chat and quite a long one. So perhaps I will let Kasim, would you like to actually ask your question to Emmanuel?
Oh, yes. Yeah, thank you very much, Emmanuel, for the interesting presentation. I just have two follow-up questions. One on the instrumental variable results. You might need to check how valid the exclusion restriction is, because it seems to be that firms that are located in districts with high rates of digital investment might also be the ones exposed to high rates of saving because of potential demand in the commercially productive districts. So you might have to check that. And then the second observation is on the PSM, the PSM results. You might have to do a covariate balance test to show the validity of the matching algorithm that you used. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kasim. I see you're struggling a little, Emmanuel. You're still sharing your screen, just so that you know.
Yes, I'm trying to.
Yeah, trying to get back to the Zoom. I can see.
Yes.
Yeah, no worries. Just while you're doing that, Fuseni, you also have your hand up. Would you like to ask some question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a quick one on the first tables you showed when you interpret the coefficients. I'm not sure I understood, because it seems to me that your dependent variable is in log, and your variables of interest are dummy variables. So if you could take maybe one example to comment them, and maybe I will have a follow-up question, because I'm not sure I understood. Thank you.
Okay, I think for now, Emmanuel, these are two quite heavy loaded questions, if you would like to answer them. Emmanuel, you're on mute. I don't know if you're speaking.
Oh, sorry. So thank you, Mr. Chair. For regarding the question on standardization, we only standardized the dependent variable. We didn't standardize the explanatory variable because it's dummy, and we can't have the standard deviation of, the standard of deviation of the dummy. So we just wanted to standardize to see how consistent our result would be. Ideally, we could have left it as a locked variable. That's it. I don't know if I have clearly answered your question.
No, it seems to be that in some of your tables, you have your dependent variable in log, right?
Okay, let me, what is wrong? Okay, yes, let me take this table, the first table you're talking about. So,
yes.
So this
I have
one,
the dependent variable in log.
Yes,
So
the model A is locked, and then the model B is standardized.
Okay. So my question was the interpretation, because you made an interpretation in terms of percentage for either COVID-19, which I think is a dummy, and digital investment, which is also a dummy, seems to me.
Right. For instance, if I take the locked variable, it's in percentage, right? So we definitely we can interpret in percentage. But indeed, the original document, we interpreted them in the form of standard deviations. So we didn't interpret them based on the percentages.
Yes, for instance, if you take 0.915, this is not 91% of difference between the two modalities. My point is that when the dependent variable is in log and you have a dummy variable, we cannot interpret the coefficients because it is a dummy variable. It is not differentiable. So what we need is the difference in the expected value of the dependent variable when the dummy is equal to 1 minus the dependent variable, the expected value when the dummy is equal to 0, divided by the dependent variable when the dummy is equal to 0. And this is equal to E to the coefficient to the beta, let's say, minus 1. So the coefficient itself.
So let me try to. So if I have the log on the left-hand side and I have a dummy variable on the right-hand side,
correct,
as a difference in difference,
we cannot interpret the coefficient of a dummy variable in an equation in which the dependent variable is in log because it is not differentiable. So we need to take the difference between the two modalities, the expected value, and then divided by the expected value of the dependent variable when the dummy is equal to 0. And if beta is the coefficient, you're right, difference in percentage is E to the beta minus 1. And even with that, we need a small correction due to Jensen inequality because we are not estimating E to the beta, but we are estimating beta, sorry. So that's what I wanted to mention.
Okay. I will take these comments and then.
Yeah, sorry, we can talk about later on, but just wanted to.
Yes, I understand. Yes, I'll
your
take it
attention.
Yes, and I'll contact you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, thank you. The purpose indeed is to debate a little bit. So no, thanks for your intervention. Are there any other questions on the line? Any other comments? If I may, it would just have been interesting to also see how more traditional investments in physical infrastructure would have compared a bit to the digital investments. I don't know if that information was available, but that perhaps would also be interesting, whether obviously firms making other types of investments would have been impacted quite so severely as well from COVID as those that didn't make investments. But maybe that would have methodologically been difficult to do. But that's, just an observation on my side.
Okay, cool.
So I see Fusini has been kind enough to share an equation in the chat, so I'll let you two hammer it out.
Okay.
In good time. Are there any also views from the audience? I see another maybe comment. Another. You still more equations. Good. So thank you. Thank you very, very much, Emmanuel Orkoh. Real pleasure to hear from you. So let me just say a few closing remarks before I actually pass on to one of the co-organizers. Thank you very much. It's been a really interesting discussion, discussing these impacts, the impact of COVID-19 on trade flows, but also on investment. I know the last presenter in particular was looking at how investment has actually helped create resilience and growth in the firms that invested in digital technologies. I'd like to thank the presenters for their very valuable presentations and the rich insights that they brought. Also very, very grateful to the organizers, the World Trade Organization and UNECA, for hosting this session, as well as the audience that participated. And just before leaving, I would just like to hand over to say a few words, Mustapha Sadi Jallab from UNECA, who would like to just say a few closing words on my behalf. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much, Paul. I used to be in UNECA until very recently and based in Dakar and Ideb, and also in Addis, but now I'm back to WTO. And this session is jointly organized with Simon. Unfortunately, Simon is not with us today, but I wanted also to thank him, and on behalf of the two of us and ECA and WTO, to thank you, Paul, for moderating such this session in such a way, eloquently. And I think it was great also to have you here, because you have been very active also on this issue, COVID-19 and trade and services in this some part of Africa, and I am pretty aware about the work you have done with ATPC. So thank you very much, Paul, for being with us today. I want also to thank very much Simon and colleagues from ECA and from the African Trade Policy Center, and of course from my organization, the WTO. I just wanted also to take the opportunity here, because I can see that Fous, Antoine are active and connected, and also to thank them, to thank IFPRI for the tremendous work they have done in also organizing training and capacity building in Africa. And just Antoine, Fous here, also we have a collective outcome, of all the investment we have put together in Africa to build a new generation of trade experts. You have seen from Tunisia, you have seen Emmanuel from South Africa on investment. We have seen also colleagues from Kenya and the Faculty of Economics working with Tabitha and Kipra. And last but not least, we have seen also colleagues from Mauritius providing some insight also about the COVID-19 for seeds economy, and I think it's quite important as well. So thank you very much, also colleagues from IFPRI and particularly Foussini, Antoine, also for the great job we have been doing in IDEP, in ECA, in ATPC since many years. So I'm not going to be too long, because we have been, very consumed by all the session. But thank you very much, all colleagues. Very much looking forward also having such sessions with young and new generation of trade experts. And once more, thank you very much as well for GTAP for giving the opportunity to have such a session. So thank you very much. And I give back the floor to our colleagues in Purdue, and also to thank the host and all colleagues from GTAP. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the day. Bye-bye.